Welcome to Lunch and Learn for March 14th, 2023. We are here at Kansas Wesleyan today to hear from Professors Anita Specht, the history professor, and Associate Professor Andrew Bedrous, who's Associate Sociology Professor. They are going to fill us in on the Electoral College. I want to say first that League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization that promotes active participation in government and urges participation as a voter. So let's welcome Professor Specht and Bedrous.
Well, thanks a lot for coming to Kansas Wesleyan to talk about the Electoral College today. I'm going to start us off with a little bit of the historical background about the Electoral College, and then Professor Bedrous is going to talk a little bit about some of the controversial elections that have popped up because of the Electoral College, and then we're going to look at some of the ways that people have proposed for dealing with some of these irregularities that come up as a result of the Electoral College. So, first thing we need to think about is, is this the best way to run a political system? This Electoral College stems from the concerns generated by the American Revolution. And when the founding fathers were debating how to develop a new government, the concerns that were most in their minds were these that are on the screen. They did not want to have, their first concern was to avoid tyranny, to make sure that no one group or person could dominate the political system and take the rights away from the citizens. They also, coming out of their own revolutionary moment, were concerned about avoiding continual rounds of revolution. How to develop a stable government that's not going to result in a revolution every time you turn around, because that's the way things were starting to look in 1787. So these folks, they want stability. They also wanted to avoid the creation of political parties, and this is something that we don't think about today. We just can't even imagine a world without political parties. But the founders did. They looked at the system in England. They said there's all these political parties, they're always fighting, there's always corruption, and we need to make a system where that's not going to happen. So they developed, in 1787, the Constitutional Convention, meeting to fix the problems that they saw in the Articles of Confederation. And one of the sticking points as they were developing the Constitution was how to elect the chief executive, the president. As they're thinking about this, they were thinking about all these options, things that they were concerned about, things that they wanted to avoid. And so one of the things that the founders had in mind was the fickleness of the population. That an ordinary person can't really be trusted with the heavy responsibility of voting. The people that are at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the spring and summer of 1787 didn't have a lot of faith in the ordinary person's ability to make a good choice. They feared that these people would be swayed by a demagogue, somebody who's a smooth talker, gets them all riled up, and they'll just make a bad choice. So they wanted to set up a system where basically you don't have an excess of democracy. They also believed that part of this is logical. The ordinary voter, the ordinary guy on the street can't know all the candidates, can't know them personally. And this is a valid point. So what they're thinking is, we need somebody to make this choice who actually knows the person that's running for this chief executive office. So they said, well, how should this be chosen? At the Constitutional Convention, there's options. Let the United States House of Representatives choose this person that's going to be the president. There's problems with that because that then brings together these two branches of government, the legislative branch and the executive branch, potentially creating conflicts of interest. That's not a good idea. Then some folks said, well, we can let the state legislatures choose the chief executive because that's the way senators were originally chosen, state legislatures chose them. But this opens the door to corruption, as it did actually with the election of senators. And the founders saw the danger in letting state legislatures choose a president. So that's, not a good idea. They kicked this can down the road for several months. This choice of how to pick a president, that got kicked into the other business, until towards the end of the convention. They finally decided the Electoral College. The solution to all those 4 issues is this. And in your handout, I put the text of the original constitutional piece that specifies the Electoral College. So you can see that states basically appoint electors, and those electors are the ones that actually pick the president. And we, as you guys all know, we've learned this since grade school probably, we don't actually vote on the president when we vote on electors. And those electors in the founders' minds are people that are wise and have good connections, and they know the people that are involved in the race, and they will make a wise choice for us. That's the way this is supposed to work. We are supposedly voting on knowledgeable local people that can exercise the best choices in government. That's the way this is supposed to work. In the founders' minds, this is going to make it so that there's no state legislature that's going to grab a lot of power over this system, that's going to have state legislatures dominating the choice of a president or of a president. So it seems like a pretty good deal. And they said this is going to avoid parties because people are going to be voting, for a local guy that they know. And that local guy is not going to be enmeshed in all of these party networks and stuff. Actually, that's one of the first things that goes out the window.
Well, it does say, in such manner as the state legislature directs. So the state legislature does have a lot of say in how that happens.
The state legislature has a lot of say in how the electors are chosen. Let's see. This worked out great to start with, because.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, absolutely.
So does that mean that back in the beginning, these local electors' names were on the ballot?
Let's see. Yes, I believe so.
Huh.
Yes.
Not George Washington's name?
No, I don't think so. I've seen an electoral ballot from when Abraham Lincoln was working, as a Whig, canvassing. And what they were voting on was not Henry Clay. They were voting on John Smith that was in Abraham Lincoln's, neighborhood, and that's who Abraham Lincoln was really trying to get elected. So, yeah, on the
Okay, so
ballot.
The elector's name was on the ballot at
That's
that
right.
point.
It was the elector's name that was on.
But in the presidential election with Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, their names were on the ballot, right?
I don't know for sure. I don't think so.
Huh.
I think what people are voting on is, Joe Smith, who's going to vote for.
Right, and
Thomas
you have to make sure you know who Joe Smith is for.
That's
Okay.
right, that's right.
Huh.
Yes. Yep. I'm pretty sure that's the way, the ballots were structured. And it was not, in the beginning, right after the Constitution is approved, it's not a problem because, man, our guy is Washington.
Right.
Internationally famous, national hero, everybody knows him, he's proven his virtue, and so it's just a hands down no-brainer, this guy is. But, given the structure of our Constitution, what starts to happen almost immediately within his very cabinet is the formation of factions, which eventually are going to coalesce into parties. And so you have your Democratic Republicans, who are headed up by Thomas Jefferson, and you have your Federalists, who are headed up by Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington, and John Adams. So by 1800, things have gone awry. And what happens is that we have this contest between the Federalist faction led by John Adams and the Democratic Republicans of Thomas Jefferson. A majority of the electors voted for the Democratic Republicans, so basically John Adams is lost. But the problem is the electors voted one vote for Thomas Jefferson, and they voted another vote for Aaron Burr, who's supposed to be the vice president. And that's the way these electors are thinking. But there's no specification in the first version of the Constitution that says you cast one vote for the president, one vote for the vice president. So what we have at the end of December 1800, you've got Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied. Neither one of them won a majority of the electoral vote, which, as this specifies, if nobody gets a majority of the electoral vote, the election is kicked into the House of Representatives. And there, it was a knockdown, drag-out fight. Because Aaron Burr, who should have stepped down and said, yeah, cast all of your ballots for Thomas Jefferson, I'm going to be vice president, he says no. He now sees a door open for his own ambitions. He's like, wow, I can pull this off. And so he had his factions within the House of Representatives, working on his behalf. And 35 ballots, and still no majority. And so what happens is Alexander Hamilton swallows his disdain for Thomas Jefferson because he hated Aaron Burr more. And he told his Federalist guys in the House of Representatives, hold your nose and vote for Jefferson, because Aaron Burr is a scoundrel. And so the Federalists that were in the House of Representatives, and they were a minority faction in the House, they were the ones that swayed the election. On the 36th ballot, they cast their lot with Jefferson, and so that's what got Jefferson into the presidency. And it's one of those things that caused Aaron Burr and Hamilton to really clash. It's also something that pretty much derailed Aaron Burr's political career, because, he wasn't playing ball with Thomas Jefferson. And so Jefferson, when he becomes president, Aaron Burr basically gets just thrown into the freezer of the vice presidency and doesn't, isn't really able to achieve his political ambitions after that. But the lesson from this is that the Electoral College isn't working real smooth. Because, what this shows us is the Constitution needs to be changed. If the election gets thrown into the House of Representatives and it's really unpredictable, Lord knows who's going to win. It's going to be the guy that can cut the best deals with House members. So no professional politician likes unpredictability. And so, one of the first things that happens is that the Constitution is going to be amended, and you can see that on the next page. And what this basically does, the 12th Amendment basically says that you have to have, when your electors vote, one vote is cast for the president, the other vote is clearly designated for the president. So that avoids this ambiguity. And, lessens the risk that it's going to go into the House of Representatives. But another thing that comes out of this crisis of the election of 1800 is that it generates a two-party system. Because, again, professional politicians, they want predictability. And so what they see is that, man, if you have 3 or 4 candidates running, the odds are they're going to split votes, and then that's going to kick it into the House of Representatives. So what these folks learn from the election of 1800 is we need to have party discipline. We need to have clear factions. We need to only have 2 candidates so that reduces the risk of an unpredictable splitting of the electoral votes, which is going to kick the election into the House of Representatives. So this is part of the reason why the Electoral College has the impact that it does. It's something that is a cornerstone for the reason why we have a 2-party system. It's something that is intended to basically make elections more predictable. And next up, we have Professor Bedrous, who's going to show us some of the the elements of unpredictability, though, that are in our system.
Well, mostly I'll talk about it. I don't have a ton to show, but so after we get past the 12th Amendment, the next of the, the first of the real controversial Electoral College outcomes is the 1824 election. So this is the Andrew Jackson election. You guys probably know this one, and maybe you remember from history or political science that this was not a big deal just because of the Electoral College. It was kind of a big deal for a lot of reasons. The direction of the country was sort of at stake. You probably heard that sort of thing more recently with all of our elections, but this was apparently the first time that it happened. So the Andrew Jackson election, 1876, Samuel Tilden, 1888, Grover Cleveland, and then the ones that I'm going to talk the most about are the ones that have happened in the last 23 years. So you guys all were around for the Al Gore election, or the Al Gore candidacy, and the Hillary Clinton candidacy, right? So these were, so these have obviously been pretty significant, and reminding myself about being nonpartisan. Obviously, I think that all of us who have been around for the last 23 years can kind of know that these were pretty substantial changes in this country in terms of the direction that we went, and a lot of the things that have happened since then can kind of be traced back to some of these particular elections. But I feel like spending a little bit of time talking about within the Electoral College system, and one of the issues that I think seems to be a little bit more and more difficult every year when I teach political science to college students, to get to the point where everybody's on the same page about the rationale for why we need an electoral college now, right? It seems like an idea that's a hard selling point to most people today. And other than appealing to the tradition of this is what we agreed upon, which doesn't really necessarily sway a lot of young voters, it seems like a pretty obvious part of the process that we use that creates a lot of headaches, and it makes a lot of the outcomes of our elections things that people are questioning and doubting and wondering if they're legitimate in the first place. And I think if you remember that we have some other parts of our electoral process that are kind of separate from the Electoral College but have been influenced by it, and I'm glad that Anita finished up talking about the political parties kind of getting a little bit of a hold there. And so, not being partisan here, but just saying that in my opinion, the political parties have become too substantial of a part of the process that we have today. Starting around the time of the 1800 election, where they start to get a little bit of power, a lot of decisions and a lot of the parts of the process that have to be sort of evaluated in every state basically get kicked to the political parties within the state to deal with coming up with solutions to all of those challenges. And remember that political parties are not even in the Constitution, right? So this is sort of an extra thing that we've added into the process without a Constitution involved. That's just become the way that we do business now. And I think that obviously leads to a little bit of a skeptical reaction for people who vote. You wonder about if this would have gone differently if a different political party had had a say in how this was going to work. We have these two political parties that have been so dominant in our society, I mean, pretty much since Lincoln, right? I mean, at the time of Lincoln, this is sort of when the parties sort of switched away from that, and the Republicans become their own thing. And today we were left with these two political parties, and most of us really can't even imagine what it would be like to have another option, right? I mean, I know that people do vote third party, but typically how do people react if you tell them you're going to vote for a third party?
You're wasting your vote.
Wasting your vote, right? This is the first thing people usually say. And even college students today still kind of feel that way. There's a little bit, I think, of maybe a competitive streak in our culture where people want to feel like they're a part of the winning team, or at least a team that has a really good, legitimate claim to the victory. And the idea of not having just two options, two teams to pick from is kind of confusing and maybe a little bit scary to some people. So we end up then with just a couple of sets of ideas that get sort of shaped by their own programs, their own platforms that aren't really a part of the political process anymore, that then come back and impact the political process. So there's a whole bunch of that sort of thing that I think is really a weird thing in the way that our system works. One of the examples of that is that we don't have anywhere, at least anywhere consistently, because all the states now get to decide for themselves, whether or not there's a requirement that the people we choose as our electors have to go along with what the people want, right? So this has been a problem, but rarely, but obviously just enough of a problem that casting that little shadow of a doubt in people's mind during an election is kind of a big deal. So I found that of all of the electors in all of the elections, only 1% of them have gone against the will of the state that they were in. But obviously it's happened relatively recently. So we've heard these stories over the last few election cycles, and I think that makes people wonder if their vote really does matter. Now you're not even voting for the president, you're voting for somebody else, and that person doesn't have to do what you want them to do either, right? So it's getting to be a harder and harder sell that you really do have a voice, at least when it comes to the presidential elections. Now every state does this differently, so there's not like a clear system to it. Some states basically make all of these policies through the political parties. So they let the parties in the state make all the rules about how the electors have to behave. There are some states that say that the electors are required to go along with the majority vote in their state. There are some that say basically you just have to go along with whatever your party picks. So if you're a Republican, you got to vote for the Republican. If you're a Democrat, you got to go with the Democrat. So that's kind of the issue that I think we have most with the Electoral College today. Is second to who are the electors is very different than I think the way that it was described by Anita in the old days, where you might have actually known these people.
Right.
Now they're kind of heavy hitters within the parties, right? So those are the people who ultimately become the electors, who probably don't know you any better than anybody else does. And it sort of seems like less and less of a viable argument for having a system like this. There was a stat that I came across on fairvote.org, which was talking about the 2000 election. And the 2000 election is one of those critical elections in which Al Gore received more of the popular vote. And you guys all remember the fiasco. This was the first time I got to vote. That was my first election. So this was my introduction into the American system. And I felt like, I was pretty ahead of the curve. I was like a young high school kid. I'm like, I'm ready to do this. I'm around paying attention to politics. I care. I have an opinion. I'm allowed to vote this time, so I'm going to vote. And I go vote, and my guy didn't win. I was disappointed my guy didn't win. But the way that it happened wasn't sort of just sorry you lost. It was sort of, there's a lot of conspiracy theories, there's a lot of reasons why you should be angry about this, why you should be doubtful about this. And I remember I was in a class in college, and the professor said, this is the first time I remember going to bed on an election night and not knowing who the president was going to be. And I just thought like, oh, well, we'll find out tomorrow or something. And it of course, drug out for a couple of months. You guys maybe recall all of the fiasco down in Florida. I don't know if they've figured out the whole hanging Chad thing or not, but I know that at the end of that, what was the end result? Anybody remember?
Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court, right? So again, something that, as far as I was aware at that point, wasn't a part of the process at all. Ultimately made the decision. So I got a bad taste in my mouth, and that was just kind of how it went for me. I imagine it's like that for other people, maybe after the 2016 election, where they kind of felt the same way with Donald Trump and all of that, and the fact that Hillary Clinton had more of the popular vote and all of those other aspects of that conversation. But anyways, the stat that I found from the 2000 election said that based on the number of people who voted and the proportions of the popular vote and the Electoral College votes that they received, 80% of the public could have stayed home and the results would have been the same, right? Because so many of those states are pretty much solid bets for the Republicans, solid bets for the Democrats, very few swing states, and those swing states are the only ones that ultimately matter that much. And of course, Florida mattered a lot in that particular election. And at the end of it, I believe it was just down to 580 votes, if I recall. I think that was the number. That's how close it was in Florida. So we're talking about a very small difference, and everybody says, oh, look, this means your vote counts. This is how important it is to participate. 500 people in Florida could have showed up and the election could have gone the other way. But I don't know if I really believe it. I already got a bad taste in my mouth. When you're 18 and it doesn't go your way, that's not an easy thing to get over. So, so I gotta just swallow my pride and deal with that and wait another 4 years for my next shot. But one of the other things that's a part of our process that I think is an important factor that relates to this is that our elections, especially at the national level, operate on this winner-take-all principle, right? So in most states anyways. So the only two states are Maine, and anybody know the other one? Nebraska, right? So the two states that split their electoral votes based on the districts in their state are Maine and Nebraska. In every other state, the winner, 50% plus one vote, gets all the electoral votes, right? So this gives, in my opinion, some really negative incentives to the process, especially because of the influence that we give the political parties. So when you have a political party then who has candidates that they want to push through, then they basically just have to sort of tailor the argument just enough to go after that group of people who might be willing to change their mind. If you're in a state like Kansas, where it seems pretty consistently in national elections that things have been going the same way for a long time, and it's not anywhere close usually, so it almost kind of feels like unless you're going to make some change here, there's no point of even bothering. I'm sure some of you feel that way sometimes here in Kansas. It can be kind of frustrating. It'd be nice to feel like voting in another way, a way that's different from what the two political parties would prefer, might give you a little bit of a chance of shifting the direction of the politics within your state or in the national level and feel like you have some actual say. So I might be the only one who feels that way, but I doubt it. I think that if we were to move away from a system that included this winner-take-all approach, it might solve some of our problems, but I don't think it would solve all of them. I think it also discourages people from wanting to participate in the first place, because what's the point if your state always goes this way? What's the point of you going? It's going to be the same people showing up who are going to vote that way, and there probably aren't going to be a whole bunch of people who change their mind about this, at the national level especially. But I do think that at the state level, and certainly at the local level, there's definitely more of an impact, and it's more direct and obvious most of the time, right? I'm sure you all feel that way as well. Usually the national elections get a lot more attention, a lot more money, a lot more flash, and so people pay attention
and a
to
lot
that.
more voters too. That's
Absolutely. And so another thing that I think is kind of a theme in my attitude about a lot of these things deals specifically with the way that political parties have all of this influence. So we have the political parties that basically demand conformity from all of their membership, especially people who have any power over how things are going to work in a state. And we end up with a lot of political parties making decisions, not just about who the electors are gonna be, but even in terms of making recommendations to the legislature about drawing the district maps and all of those kind of things. And you all know where that goes. That's definitely one of those issues that has been very old, but is brand new again. You know, I've seen some of these maps. I was looking at a map for Louisiana, where they gerrymandered a nice little district down there that basically stretches from New Orleans to Baton Rouge. It's like 120 miles or something like that. Just this nice little long skinny thing right through the middle of the state, but one blue district surrounded by a bunch of red districts. These kind of things aren't by accident, right? This is definitely intentional, and we're giving a lot of the power then to people who we can't hold accountable, a political party, right? The only accountability that they can face is to not choose the people they put up. But because people want to pick a winner, they feel like those are the choices they get, one party or the other. So keep in mind here, this isn't just one party doing it. I think both parties have kind of the same approach here, and that's definitely something to pay attention to. But I think the biggest challenge here is coming up with a viable alternative. So what could the system look like? What would be better than the current system, some of the problems that it has? And I guess that's nice to talk about, but then how practical would it be to get people on board with an idea to actually get something changed? So we're gonna kind of move into that, sort of what can we do, what kind of options do we have, and all that. I think you had some slides in here for that, Anita, is that right?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so what should be our goals as a country? And I think this is kind of a pretty important thing that nobody ever really talks about. We're obviously not the same country that we once were. It's changed. It's probably changed in your own lifetimes. It's probably going to continue to change. So it seems like there has to be kind of a moment where we can come together and decide what is it exactly as a society, as a country, our goals are going to be. What's the most important part of having a system is that we either share values or we share a process, right? So it has to be one of both of these things, maybe both of them ideally. But I think if we're gonna value some things about the way that our system works, we probably should be in agreement about them. Otherwise, we're just gonna end up with a lot of disappointed people, potentially for generations who don't wanna participate in politics, who don't wanna get involved. And I think that's kind of where we're at now. We're sort of at that moment here where you feel like you're basically begging people to get involved in politics, and they don't see the salience to their own lives anymore a lot of the time, unless there's some specific issue or candidate that they really don't like. Otherwise, we're trying to convince them that this is something they should be involved in. So, do you want to talk about these a little?
No, hit the next slide.
Okay.
Yeah, these are some of our options. There's over the last 50 years, there have been 700 proposals put forward in Congress for changing the Electoral College. And I've just put on the slide here a few of them, and in your handout packet, there's some little graphics that kind of explain some of this. The first thing on the big picture shows how the system is working now, and with, as Professor Bedrous explained, sort of the predominance of a winner-take-all system of grabbing electors, except for Nebraska and Maine, which can split them. And so there are a couple of options for dealing with this. One of them is to eliminate the Electoral College, which, let's see, there's, remember the statistic, I think 56% of Americans want to eliminate the Electoral College.
Mm-hmm. Sounds right.
Yeah. 58% of Americans want to eliminate the Electoral College. And if that was done based on the second page of the big picture, what you would see is that, we just go with the popular vote. And, in the 2016 election, that would have meant that Hillary Clinton would have won that election. But there are some other options for proportionaling your state's electoral votes. If you don't want to eliminate the Electoral College entirely.
Well, wait a second.
Yep, sorry, okay.
Shouldn't we do the pros and cons of going with the popular vote? Is that like the
Yep.
So it's easy. So why shouldn't we do it?
I think it's a good idea. I think that the selling of this is going to be hard to do because of the influence of political parties. But I think
Why
that's-
don't they want that?
I think because generally speaking, it's something that either explicitly benefits the party's chances of success, and they don't want to get rid of it because they see that that might actually make a difference in terms of the outcomes. So, trying to be partisan about it, but typically I would argue that generally the Republicans are sort of hanging on largely through the Electoral College. You know, interestingly, the two elections that are kind of in the last 23 years where this was controversial are elections that Republicans ended up winning with fewer than the popular vote would have dictated.
And particularly to get it passed by in the Senate, where you have much more predominant voting power to rural states which tend to be Republican. Both houses are, they're roadblocks, but particularly in the Senate.
Absolutely. So I mean, I think that's the biggest, probably the biggest con or the biggest challenge that I could come up with. That would be a part of just going with the popular vote. I think it is simpler. I think people today, a lot of the rationales that I think were used to create the Electoral College in the first place, basically this idea that the average person doesn't know anything and why would we let them pick the president? I don't think people necessarily know any more than they did, but I think at least we have an opportunity to find out now a little bit more. It's a little bit more democratic access to information now than there once was, certainly during the time where they came up with this plan. And I think that generally speaking, people would probably like to feel the pride or the sorrow, I guess, that comes along with having an election and knowing that your vote is just counted the same as everybody else's, and this is the result. To me, those all sound like good reasons to do it. It seems like when I talk about this with college students, that's what they would all prefer. To them, it just makes sense. It sounds like the fairest way to do it. You count the votes, and whoever has the most votes wins. There are probably a lot of people in certain states where their party's hanging on by a thread who don't necessarily want to go that way, just for the reason that their party probably would lose.
I think it also opens the door for more third-party candidates, which again throws unpredictability into the system, which neither Democrats nor Republicans want.
Well, and couldn't you have, to accomplish that, ranked choice voting, and there are, I know, a variety of schemes out there. But if you had ranked choice, that in particular would give third-party or independent candidates much more opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I believe interestingly that at the very beginning, Anita, you can correct me, but at the very beginning, one of the pieces of the Constitution kind of talked about the states having to pick two candidates, a first and a second place, with one of them not coming from the same state that they were in. So there was kind of this requirement that they weren't just picking their own hometown person. And I know that kind of just went out the window when the parties got involved. You know, the parties are here now, so you're going along with what the party says, and that's, requires a discipline, everybody following along with whoever's in charge. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge. Of course, the other thing that would be challenging is that for a lot of people, despite all its flaws, this is what the Constitution says. And there's a lot of people who just feel like that's, just sort of this important document, maybe even sort of holy to some people, and you can't change it. You certainly can't change it just because you want to see a difference in our outcomes, and maybe the Founding Fathers are infallible or whatever, right? Some people definitely, I think, take that perspective.
Another thing that would be an argument in favor of the Electoral College is that, when the founders created it, it was supposed to be a break on an out-of-control an electorate that's going to pick somebody that's going to be a dictator. That's another concern with the creation of the Electoral College. And so, by eliminating the Electoral College, you remove that potential break on an out-of-control system. However,
If the electors go against
exactly,
what the.
that's the thing, that's the thing. If your states have the provisions so that an elector can vote independently, that's when that safety break will be effective.
Yep. So the other one next to that, these next two I think are kind of similar to each other, just sort of about potentially allocating the electoral votes in a slightly different way, based on the popular vote in the congressional district or the popular vote in the state or something along those lines. And there have been a few different proposals over the years for people who wanted to do that. I think that obviously that sounds like a good idea, probably more so in some states than others, which I think is kind of a part of the flaw here is that, again, the political parties tend to have a little bit more control if they can get everybody in the state to do what they say. And so that becomes then a big part of the way that the process shakes out in different states, depending on where you look. I would also throw into the mix here, I'll skip to the last one here, which was the interstate compact idea, where a number of states have already kind of come together. 16 states, I believe.
That's on the last page of your handout.
So 16 states have come together, and combined those 16 states represent 195 electoral votes. So that's a pretty big chunk of what you would need to choose the president. And basically decided that within those states, they're going to basically require the electoral votes to go towards the person who wins the popular vote in that state. Right, so this sounds like a good idea for the most part. There have also been another 9 states who represent another 88 electoral votes. So if those 9 states got this through as well, and they've been able to get it through one of their chambers of legislation, not both, so they're getting the process moving forward, but it's probably stalled out at this point. But if those states that had already started making motion in this regard were all to get this done, then we would already end up with enough electoral votes to pick a president. Right? So we'd only end up taking, the total there would be 25 states. Half of the states could provide enough electoral votes to determine who the president's going to be. And the other states probably wouldn't really matter that much, I guess.
How many electoral votes did you say the 16 states have?
The 16 have 195, and then the 9 that have passed in one chamber have another 88. So we're at 200 and, I say the wrong number, 283 votes. So we're already past the threshold, right? You need to hit 270 electoral votes to win the presidency. So just those 25 states alone, if they were to pass this, would have enough electoral votes that the popular vote in those half the states could pick the president. Doesn't mean that they're all going to vote the same way, right? That's kind of the other part of this. That's where the other states come into the picture here.
So, the things that have passed is not that your electors have to vote for the popular vote of the country. It's just the popular vote of that state.
Yeah. Yep.
That's not that dissimilar to the Electoral College now.
Yeah, that's true.
In the interstate compact, they would then pledge to vote for the elector of the country, the popular vote of the
Okay.
country. Yes,
Oh.
yes.
So then what you're saying is that if more than 270 electors are pledged to vote the popular vote of the country,
Yes.
then
Exactly.
the popular vote then would matter.
There you go. Yeah, that's it. Mhm.
So can you explain the fourth one there?
The fourth one, I think, to me, that's the most interesting one, because, and you sent me that little thing, and I also, Fordham Law School is also talking about this with an interesting paper. But basically, in 1929, the Congress passed a law that limits the size of the House of Representatives to 435 members. And, it can't grow more than that. And so what is being proposed in some quarters is to do away with that 1929 Permanent Apportionment Act and allow the House of Representatives to expand. If you allow the House of Representatives to get more members on it based on the population of the largest states, then that is then going to expand your electoral college in a way that is going to reflect the strength of the popular vote. So because
Sounds like it would cost a lot though, paying all those people
Well,
and their
this is-
pensions forever.
yeah, I hadn't thought of that.
I mean, it can still have some of the same problems, but I found, this is from a different source, but I'm going to show you really quick of the calculation here that I've got from fairvote.org, and I'll show you their table, basically compares the number of people who are represented by each of the electors in different sized states. And it varies so greatly that it turns out that the votes all don't count the same. And so this sounds like the only real way to fix that. I mean, I guess the other way would be to increase the number of people that each elector represents. But, so for example, in Wyoming, every elector, yeah. In Wyoming, every elector there represents 177,556 residents. In Texas, every elector represents 715,499 constituents. So just based on that alone, it seems kind of like we're admitting to ourselves that we understand that everybody's vote does not count equally, right? At least when it comes to voting for the president. So I also found on there, they had this table from the 2008 election where they had used the population data from that time and looked at all the states, and they compare basically the percentage of voters per elector in that state compared to the US. So you get kind of an average here. So the United States at the top here, 100% is the average here, so that's not going to change for anything else. But the state of Alaska, or the state of Alabama, based on their population, gets to have about an extra 9% of influence there when it comes to the national vote for the president. Alaska, 247%. So they're getting a lot more. I don't know why, here we go. I don't know why they're, that seems like a pretty dramatic difference there, 247% for people up in Alaska. And then for some of the bigger states, you've got Arizona at 87%, California 85%, Florida 83%, Georgia 88%. So it really just kind of, in my opinion, is sort of showing some data that the current system we have is sort of biased disproportionately to the lower population states.
And so the number of electors is the number in the House plus the 2 senators, right?
Yep.
So Wyoming only has, I think, like 1 person in the House, but they've got 2 senators, just like everybody else. So if you expanded the number of House members, then the little rural states might not get any more House members, but the big states would get more House members. So anyway, the discrepancy because of those 2 senators is less.
Right.
Well, is that what I'm saying? Anyway.
And that's why, also why, these ideas to, allocate electors proportionally, that's why that's gonna get hung up. Because the smaller states still have those 2 senators that are going to give even a proportional allocation of electors more sway to the small rural states because of those 2 senators. I don't know if this makes sense.
I mean, it seems like at the end of the day, the issue here is that we have to have a system that seems legitimate to people, right? And that's I think, kind of the cornerstone of the whole idea of having democratic elections. If it doesn't seem legitimate, then what's the point? Why take it seriously? Why listen to the outcome? Why do anything, right? And I feel like we have a lot of examples where the system that we have in place has a bunch of problems. It's very clear not everybody's vote is counted the same. It's very clear that the process has been sort of, I'm going to argue, a little bit hijacked by political parties along the way. The intention of giving the states control over elections sounds wise when you're trying to keep the federal government from being too powerful, but it also all of a sudden becomes folly when it's political parties that you give the power to instead.
What was the Kansas number on
Oh,
that?
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'll check on that real quick. Wyoming was 300 and something percent too,
Wow.
318.
Yeah.
So Kansas is 121. So we get a little bit more influence in the presidential election than we probably should, right, at the end of the day. When I was looking at this earlier, I was just quickly jumping to all the swing states, trying to look at those and see if that made any difference. Depending on the year, I guess, who the swing states are going to be. Pennsylvania, 95, so they're down a little bit. Florida's down a little bit. Who else am I missing? Georgia.
It was up at the top, it was 80 something.
Georgia 88 also.
But I mean, this is an issue too. I mean, should Kansas want to give up, some of this electoral power that it has?
Right.
I mean, maybe this would be a really bad deal for Kansas.
Well, if you're like the majority of Kansans, then, but
Yeah.
if you're not like the
I
majority
know.
of Kansans, then.
Yeah.
And to state the obvious, even if you get a system where every popular vote is counted, and everybody's vote counts equally, which still might be something that would appeal to fair-minded Kansans, you have the question of how the word gets out, even if you have ranked choice voting, how does a candidate get their word out? in a fairly broken communication system that requires money principally. How do you
Yeah.
overcome the effect of that money?
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, access to the voting booths and all those other things, you know.
Except that the people who go to the voting booth uninformed, not as smart as you and I, Ruth, are gonna not vote right.
It's always in the eye of the beholder, I
Yeah.
know.
But Ruth has a good point. If people feel like they have an equal vote, that is at least a motivation to participate. Which is the main.
Anita, you had a slide that we didn't really dwell on that had, what are our country's values? Could we go back to that? Yeah, that one. Because you had promote democracy versus limit democracy.
There are a lot of people that would say, we need to limit democracy. We can't have all of these people voting
Because
because,
we're too stupid.
That's right.
well, they're too stupid or they're gonna vote the way we don't want them to vote. So, you know,
Exactly.
for the people that are in power, it is not in their interest to entertain a change. I mean, you know, that is just reality, and we have to be aware of it. That's not my values, I disagree with that, but, you know, there's a very powerful faction in the country, you know, in both parties, because, you know, that's the goal of, you know, of a party, winning elections.
Right.
That is it, and, you know, they will do whatever it takes to win. First rule of politics, win the election.
It's your Supreme Court that you want.
That did used to be it.
So, that's the end of your presentation? Then you-
That's all that we've got.
Hey, let's give him a hand. Hey, thank you, and thank you for coming, and thank you for watching, if you're watching on the video. Our next event is our next speaker in Salina is at our annual meeting, which is going to be Reverend Rachel Pryor from the KIFA, the Kansas Interfaith Alliance. That's going to be on the third Saturday in April. And so I think that's April 15th. And we'll be having that at the Courtyard by Marriott in the afternoon, about 1 o'clock, I think, as our business meeting starting. And we'll also have a dessert bar for your pleasure, eating pleasure. So thank you for coming, and thank you to the professors here. Let's give